Okay, this lecture gets more detailed than the one that we had some weeks ago, or was it last week or the week before, where we did in fact cover flight instruments. But this time we're going to be covering it in a little bit more detail. And what's really important is not that you remember what an airspeed indicator is, but you will note the differences that it's going to report based on things like absolute altitude, true altitude, pressure altitude. Those things will come up in this lecture. That's what's going to make this lecture different from the lecture that you had a week and a half ago when we had aircraft systems and flight instruments. That was the name of the lecture about 10 days ago, I believe. So the reason I'm identifying international organizations is because a lot of the things in aviation are determined by these organizations. But more importantly, the one at the bottom called the International Civil Aviation Organization is a group that really defines an awful lot about what we do here in the United States. To go back a little bit in time, the United States was essentially the world leader in establishing standards for aviation. I also want to remind you that up until now, you have been quizzed on almost entirely the information that you see on the PowerPoint presentation. But from this point on, if I say something that's not on that PowerPoint presentation and it appears to be a reasonably important thing for you to note, it's up to you to put that in your notes. Okay, everybody understand that? Okay, International Civil Aviation Organization defines, among other things, some of the standards that we have today, and we'll talk about those. So here are the three categories of instruments that we're going to look at. We talked about this before: pedostatic instruments, gyroscopic instruments, magnetic instruments. And they're grouped that way. In almost every aircraft after 1961 or so, the groupings have been what we call a T. Those are the important instruments in flight, is the T instrument. So the airspeed, the attitude indicator, what is that? Altimeter, right, and heading indicator. It's called the T grouping. It didn't occur in the aircraft up until about, I think, 1961 or 62. In fact, I'm actually teaching a student now to fly power, and he has a 1961 Cessna 172, and it does not have that T grouping. So I know for sure that up until 1961, they were using whatever grouping they thought they wanted, the manufacturers thought they wanted. Okay, so the atmospheric conditions are really important because the four instruments the three groupings of instruments all are going to measure something about the atmosphere. And so the first thing that comes to mind is we know that the temperature goes down as you go up in altitude. So let's say at about 35,000 feet, it's 70 below zero. Now you don't have to write that down because I'm not going to be worried about 35,000 feet for you. We're really talking about everything below 18,000 feet. But temperature does go down, and it goes down at the rate of, you can use either one of those, either Fahrenheit or you can use Celsius, but it goes down at 3.5 degrees per 1,000 feet. So if you were going to go up to Huntington Lake, and your family said, well, what do you think the temperature is at Huntington Lake? If it was 80 on the ground in Fresno, you can calculate, because Huntington Lake is 7,000 feet. So 7 times 3.5, right, is about 24.5 degrees. So it's 24.5 degrees colder at Huntington Lake than it is at Fresno at 80. So if it was 80 at Fresno, what would it be up there? Quick. No, okay. 50, right? 56, 56.5, 55.5. These are generally standard average kinds of pieces of information. It doesn't always occur that right way, right? Because there's never a perfectly uniform decrease in temperature as you go up. Sometimes it's fast, sometimes it's slow. and it depends on altitude. We also have the pressure lapse rate. That is that the pressure on the ground is one thing. The pressure at 18,000 feet turns out to be half of the pressure on the ground. So if the pressure on the ground on a standard day is, everybody remember that? Jacob? Nico? Damien? 14.7 tenths, 14.7 pounds is the pressure on the ground. That's the standard pressure on the ground. So at 18,000 feet, it would be 7.35, right? 7.35 pounds per square inch. That's the pressure lapse rate. Now, to be able to look at it in terms of your altimeter, the altimeter has a little gauge on it, and it sets the barometric pressure. Because remember we talked about the fact that across the United States there are high-pressure systems and low-pressure systems. If the entire United States was uniform, we wouldn't have to worry about making changes to the altimeter. But because it's not uniform, because we may be flying from through a high-pressure system and onto a low-pressure system, we need to make adjustments in the altimeter so that it reflects the pressure area that we're in at the time. You'll see that in one of these pictures that I'm going to show you of the instruments. We remember that 29.92 was the standard pressure, and that's in inches of mercury. Long ago, about 250 years ago actually, they set up water, and the pressure was able to drive the water up to 34 feet. So that was one of the first altimeters. One of the barometric pressure devices was 34 feet of water. But instead of that, they decided to use mercury, because mercury is 14 times as dense as water. And so now with mercury, it only goes up to 29 inches. That's the standard. Sometimes it goes higher, 30, 31 inches, 32 inches. But generally speaking, it's well under a meter high. So what you have is you have a measurement, and most often you will hear in the world of aviation, they talk about inches of mercury. Once in a while, they'll talk about other ways to measure it, but I want you just to remember that it's inches of mercury. So the pressure lapse rate on the inches of mercury is that if you go up 1,000 feet, now the standard day will go down to 28 inches, won't it? Starts out at 29.92, standard day, and if you go up 1,000 feet, it'll go down to 28.92, then 27.92, depending on how high you go. So every 1,000 feet is 1 inch of mercury. Atmospheric weight, this is the one Damien just told us about, 14.7 tenths pounds per square inch. You may want to write down that at 18,000 feet, it's half of that number. And we talked about why 18,000 feet is important. Because when aircraft get to 18,000 feet, no matter what their barometric pressure setting was on the ground, when they get to 18,000 feet, all of them are required to reset their altimeters to 29.92 inches of mercury. So every aircraft flying in the world today above 18,000 feet, their altimeters are set to 29.92. That is a worldwide convention, a standard that was set by ICAO and other organizations in the years gone by. Pressure systems. We talked about this before. There are high pressure systems and low pressure systems. And what's important about that is that when you're flying from point to point, you're going to be going through these systems. I've flown coast to coast maybe, 20 times perhaps, I suppose. So going coast to coast, I had to reset my altimeter numerous times on the way because I kept going in and out of areas where the pressure was different at my altitude. So when you see on television, they have a big red H for high pressure and a big blue L, I believe, for low pressure. The circulation around those is opposite one another. High pressure circulates clockwise, low pressure circulates counterclockwise. That was a crucial factor in my young former student going around the world, because when he left, did I tell you about this already? When he left Japan, he needed to get to the Aleutian Islands, 2,000 some odd miles away, 2,200 miles away. And it was at night, and it turned out that there were two pressure systems, one coming down from Russia and one coming up from the Western Pacific. They were rotating in opposite directions. So by going between them, he got a slingshot effect that saved his butt when he got to the Aleutian Islands, because his intended stop was fogged in. He couldn't land there. He had to go another 450 miles northeast to a place called Dutch Harbor, and there he finally landed, and he had enough fuel to do it, only because I was able to get him to go out between these two weather systems. He was pretty reluctant to do it because it was at night, and we knew that there was some icing aloft, and he was going to get a little bit of icing, and he did, and he called me and said he wanted to turn back, and I said, no, you need to keep on going. You'll be clear of those two systems pretty quickly. And sure enough, he stayed on his course, went through those two systems, and got about a 60-knot tailwind. That's what got him to the Aleutian Islands much sooner. Okay, so the internationally set temperature and pressure representing a worldwide standard day. And that standard day is 59 degrees Fahrenheit. Where do you think they got that? Well, one day, every airport in the world was reporting their temperature. So they added them all together and divided by the number of airports reporting. And they came up with 59. Then they did it again the next day. Then again the next day. And it turns out there were so many thousands of temperatures reported that they kept coming up with an average of 59 degrees. So they said, okay, from now on, a standard day worldwide, 59 degrees Fahrenheit. They did the same thing with pressure. They pulled every pressure reporting station, airport in the world, and they all gave different pressure readings, right? Because some airports had a high pressure system over them, some airports had a low pressure system over them. But by taking the average of all of those, it turns out to be 29.92 inches of mercury. So all aviators, all people involved in aviation, whether we are mechanics, and they're important to mechanics, pilots, or tower controllers, everybody accepts the fact that a standard day is 29.92 inches of mercury. So a lot of things that are built or maintained in aviation are set on the basis of 29.92. Okay, we're going to look at the grouping called pedostatic instruments. Everybody remember what that means? What are the instruments that are driven by the pedostatic system? Anybody? The what now? Okay, altimeter's one. What else? I didn't hear. Vertical speed indicator is another one, right? Airspeed indicator. We had the airspeed indicator, the altimeter, and the vertical speed indicator, right? Okay, good. The altimeter. There's what it looks like. In this particular case, this altimeter is recording an altitude of not quite 1,000 feet, right? 920 feet above sea level. This particular arrow here represents 10,000. So if this moves over here, it means that it's now surpassed 10,000 on its way to 11,000. So it would be 10,920 feet if this was over here. Now, everybody notice that little window there. And this knob right here. So, it means that everywhere you fly, And it's particularly important if you're flying in what I call IMC, which is instrument meteorological conditions. You are required by law to reset your altimeter every 15 minutes. And that's because you're flying through a lot of changing pressure systems. So if you didn't change it, let's assume you were in a high pressure, in a low pressure system, right? And you're flying from low pressure to high pressure. So let's go the other way, because it's a little more dangerous the other way. High to low, watch out below is a nice little phrase to remember. But if you're going from high to low, you're in a high pressure system and you're at let's say 3,000 feet of altitude. You continue on, you haven't changed anything, your airplane hasn't descended or climbed, you're still at what you think is 3,000 feet. But now, all of a sudden, you start seeing the altimeter going up. And you think, oh, maybe I better descend. I'll start descending to go back to 3,000 feet. Because when you're flying around, the air traffic controllers want you to stay at your assigned altitude. So you descend down to 3,000 feet. That's wrong, right? What you did is you went to a low-pressure system. The low-pressure system said to your altimeter, hey, we're going up, right? Because you go high to low, high pressure to low pressure. Low pressure means you're going up. So now you're flying along lower than you should be because you didn't reset your altimeter. Okay. It's really critical. I mean, it's so critical, especially when you can't see the ground. You're flying in fog. You're flying in storms, right? Okay, so now there are several different altitudes, and I've kind of made them a little bit easier to understand. Absolute altitude is any altitude that you're above anything. So if you're above the sea, it's absolute altitude. If you're above the ground, it's absolute altitude. Again, if you're above the ground, it's only the distance between you and the ground, not between you and sea level. So absolute altitude actually has several different meanings. The meaning is you're above anything. Well, if it's above sea level, then it's true altitude and absolute altitude are the same thing, aren't they? Because if absolute altitude is above anything, and if you're flying over the sea, then your absolute altitude is the same as true altitude. Gliders worry about absolute altitude because we're concerned about having to land somewhere when we run out of lift if we happen to be in the mountains. So if we're in the mountains, we only have a couple thousand feet below us. So if we're going to run out of lift, we want to head for some place where we can land away from the mountains. That gives us an extra 1,000 or 2 feet to get away from the mountains and land. But I can tell you that most aircraft use true altitude, above mean sea level. So when you see an altitude of, say, 3,000 feet, it'll be 3,000 MSL, mean sea level. Now there's something else called pressure altitude, and that's important for certain elements where you want to determine density altitude. Density altitude is a function of temperature and pressure. Temperature and humidity. But also pressure altitude is the same thing that all aircraft switch to when they get to 18,000 feet. They have to turn their altimeter that little window, they have to turn that to 29.92. I want to interject something here. I'll go back here for a minute and say that there is one kind of altitude that turns out to be important, but it gets a little complex, and it's called density altitude. And density altitude is, let's say, an aircraft taking off out of Chandler is going to be taking off at roughly 300 feet above sea level. But if it's a hot day, a really hot day, I've seen that altitude, density altitude, go up to 3,600 feet. That means that your aircraft is going to behave as though it was taking off from an altitude of 3,600 feet on a standard day. So density altitude is critical. For example, at Lake Tahoe, you can fly into Lake Tahoe in the morning, and if it turns out to be very warm by the afternoon, you probably don't have enough runway or engine power to take off. because the density altitude could be up as far as 9,000 feet. And if you're not flying a big airplane and you have a lot of people in your airplane, you're not going to be able to take off. You're just going to have to stay there overnight. So in high altitude mountain flying, it is often the case where nobody flies in the afternoon when it's hot. They all fly early in the morning. They take off in the morning and land, and they try to arrive as soon as they can so that they don't have to worry too much about it. Now, taking off is more critical, obviously, than landing. You can land in a high density altitude situation, but taking off is another thing. Okay, airspeed. An airspeed indicator, as we know, is pretty fundamental, right? It just measures ram air pressure into the pitot tube. Ram air pressure into the pitot tube. What's important about looking at this graphic is the color markings. The white arc is what is called the flap operating range. And here's what's important about that. First of all, because when you put the flaps on, if you're going too fast, you can damage the flap. Right? What this allows you to do, it allows you to stall at 60. And if you didn't have any flaps on at all, your stall would be 65. So one of the functions of flaps is to lower the stall speed, give you more lift. Right? When you put on the flaps, we talked about that the other day. When the flap goes down, it increases the virtual camber of the wing. And by increasing the virtual camber of the wing, it allows you to get more lift for the same angle of attack. Okay? So in that case, the green is the normal operating range of the aircraft. But again, if you want to land at the slowest speed, you've got to put the flaps on. It gives you an extra 5, sometimes more than that. Some aircraft have up to 8 or 9 miles an hour difference between the flap operating range and the normal operating range. Okay, the yellow. What does everybody think the yellow is? What does yellow represent? Caution? Yeah, it represents an area where you want to be very, very careful if you are flying at that airspeed, because you should only use the yellow arc if the air is smooth. If the air becomes turbulent, get out of that yellow arc. I don't think I've ever made it a practice in my lifetime to just routinely fly in the yellow arc, because I can't predict whether 2 minutes down the way I'm going to run into turbulence. It could be a very smooth day from here to, say, New Mexico, and then I take off out of New Mexico and it's smooth for a while, and then all of a sudden I get the heck knocked out of me because I'm into the area of Oklahoma and Kansas where there are fierce up and down drafts. So I don't spend a lot of time. I rarely fly in that yellow arc. And so what's the red arc? The red line? Yeah, never exceed speed. And the reason that you don't want to do that is because once you pass the red arc, or the red mark, you now become a test pilot. Because when they designed these airplanes and put them into assembly, they said, we haven't tested what happens to this airplane when it gets beyond red line. Things like flutter, for example. You can have your ailerons at some high speed start fluttering, and if they do, in about a second and a half, they will flutter so badly they'll tear themselves off your wing. So you don't want to exceed red line because you don't want to be a test pilot. So if you think you want to be a test pilot, go ahead. Fly past the red line. I wouldn't recommend it. Okay, there are several ways that you can measure airspeed, right? One is miles per hour. And that means that you're using statute miles, 5,280. 5,280 statute miles. And that's the most common in light aircraft until 1977. Don't worry about that. Don't worry about 1977. Don't write that down. It's not worth it. I'm just telling you when I remember that Cessna and Piper and Beechcraft and all the rest of them began to manufacture aircraft that changed at that point in time. Right? So miles per hour was fairly standard up until about 77. From then on, they went to knots, K-N-O-T-S, which represents nautical miles. Nautical miles are 6,076 feet. It's interesting because if you want a real definition of it, it came from boating. It came from shipping over the past thousand years or more. And it represents 1 minute of arc at the equator. 1 minute. Remember, there are 360 degrees, 60 minutes, 60 seconds. That's how you measure all the way around the globe. 360 degrees. You can break that down into 60 minutes and then break that down. Well, one arc, a 60 minute, 1 minute of arc at the equator represents a knot, a nautical mile, and that turns out to be 6,076 feet. Now, I can tell you that from all kinds of calculations that we do in light planes and gliders, we kind of round it off. We say 6,000 feet. That's good enough. That's close enough. Because what is the percentage of 76 out of 6,000? Is it less than 1%? Oh, no, it's a little over 1%, right? It's about 1.2%. It's not significant for the kind of early flying we do. All right, now there are different ways to denote speed. One is called the indicated airspeed, and that's the thing that you will look at the most, because when you look at your airspeed indicator, you are looking at indicated. Your airspeed indicator is indicating to you that your speed is, let's say, 100. Is that the airspeed that actually you are witnessing going through the air? Not necessarily, no. Because if the air is much thinner, then your indicated airspeed could say 100, but you might be doing 120 through the air. If the air is really heavy and thick in the wintertime, and your indicated airspeed says 100, you might only be doing 90 through the air. So indicated airspeed. However, here's an interesting piece of information you need to write down. The airplane will stall at the same indicated airspeed regardless of the altitude. You could be at 30,000 feet and that aircraft will stall at the same indicated airspeed that it does near the surface of the earth. Okay, so the next airspeed is calibrated airspeed. And the difference there is it's the airspeed that is corrected for instrument and installation. Do we use it often? No. I can tell you in my 8,000 hours of flying, I don't think I've ever really paid any attention to calibrated airspeed. I think that mostly the equipment manufacturers and the performance people, that is the people who put performance charts in your pilot operating handbook, are concerned about making sure that they give you information that is based on the most accurate airspeed. And they'll identify that in the charts. So if there's a chart that says, here is your fuel burn per 1,000 feet, or per speed, whatever the speed is, they will say probably 120 miles an hour CAS or TAS. They will indicate to you whether or not they're using true airspeed or calibrated airspeed. And the last one is true airspeed. Now, it's interesting because some airspeed indicators have a way of adjusting for temperature and altitude. I didn't show you a picture of that because it's a little bit more confusing to look at. But the airspeed indicator that I have on my Dakota, I can adjust it for temperature and pressure, temperature and altitude, and true airspeed. So, Jacob, to answer your question, I think most people kind of just leap over calibrated. I like true because I have just a little dial. If I match altitude with temperature on that same dial, then the needle is pointing directly at true airspeed. So I like true airspeed because I know that when I get up at an altitude, like I've made a lot of trips to San Diego, and when I get up there, I fly down there 12,500 feet, I know that I'm flying a lot faster than what my indicated airspeed says. Okay, so I covered this just briefly before here, and most of you are going to recognize the fact that other than black, here are the markings and what they mean. Most of the time we're concerned with the white and green arcs because when we get down low in airspeed, we're concerned about whether or not we're going to be going too slow. Should we add flaps or not? Well, if we're getting down around 65 or 70 miles an hour, we're probably going to want to put on at least one flap. That gets us maybe a little bit into the white arc. But we certainly don't want to be going very, very slow with no flaps at all, because now we're going to be stalling at the bottom of the green arc rather than at the bottom of the white arc. Now, I can grant that you will probably not all remember this information, but the next time or any time, a couple of years from now, you get in an airplane, somebody's going to take you for a ride, or I'm going to try to take you for a ride. Hopefully we're going to have an airplane maybe based out at Reedley Airport where I can take each of you for a good demo ride. In that case, when you get in the airplane, you'll be sitting in the captain's seat, the left seat, and you'll be looking right at the airspeed indicator, and all of a sudden you're going to remember, oh, that's right, there are those markings, the white, the green, the yellow, and the red. And you'll start trying to remember exactly what it means. But don't worry about it. I just want you to be familiar enough so that when you see an airspeed indicator and you see those colors, they mean something. Okay? They mean something. Okay, vertical speed. Here's a vertical speed indicator. In a glider, this vertical speed indicator is highly sensitive that it will move instantaneously if we're going through a thermal or if we're going through a column of sink, which is going through thermals. We want to find this in the sink. In an aircraft, in a light aircraft, it is not a significant instrument. In fact, it's the only instrument you'll find on the panel that is not required for instrument flying. Again, does everybody know what I'm talking about when I say instrument flying? You're allowed to fly in fog. You're allowed to fly in cloud where you can't see the ground. You can't see the horizon. You're only concentrating on your instruments to keep you right side up. Right, that's instrument flying. Okay. So it's the only instrument not required in instrument flight. But it's a lot of fun because if I'm coming back from San Diego at 12,000 feet, I'll say to myself, all right, I want to start descending at 500 feet a minute, and I need to lose 11,000 feet, right? I don't want to hit the ground. I want to lose 11,000 feet. So how many minutes is that? 500 feet a minute, 11,000 feet? Anybody? I want to lose 11,000 feet. I'm losing it at 500 feet a minute. 22 minutes, right? So when I look at my GPS or whatever I've got, and I decide that I'm about 22 minutes out from Fresno, I'll begin a 500 feet a minute descent. So it's a fun instrument to use if you know how to use it and use it wisely. Okay, it measures climbs or descents, and it measures it in feet per minute. Feet per minute descent, feet per minute climb. Remember, not required in instrument flight. I don't think I wrote that there, but that ought to give you a clue that it might be one of those things you would write down in your notes just because I said it and it's important. Okay, now we're going to move to the gyroscopic instruments, and everybody already understands what a gyroscope is. In fact, if you're ever at a toy store, buy yourself one of those little gyroscopes, those little things that you put a string on and you pull it real hard and make it spin, and then you can set those little things on knife edges, you can hold them on your finger, you can put them on a string, and they won't move because once it starts rotating, in fact, and I don't want to get into physics, but once it starts rotating, the fact is that it avoids movement. But also what's interesting is that when you have something rotating, the pressure point is not at the top. If you wanted to push it over, you'd have to push it at 90 degrees. It's a little odd, and we aren't going to get into it here, but that's the case in gyroscopes. So the instruments we're going to be talking about here are gyroscopically driven. And the reason I have the vacuum and electric is that most of the time up until, I don't know, maybe up until 10 years ago, 15 years ago, they were vacuum driven. So if you get into a light plane, way over on the right-hand side, there's a little vacuum gauge, and it says 5 psi. So it has to be, your vacuum has to be between 4 point something psi and 7. Usually it's 5, and the aviation maintenance guys set it for 5, so it stays at 5. I am not sure why they use vacuum instead of just plain old air pressure. I don't know. So if any of you want to look that up or want to write about it, that would be one way to do it. And also, by the way, your essay drafts are due today, aren't they? Okay. So before classes break, you want to pass those forward. Okay, the first one is the attitude indicator. And that doesn't mean it's your attitude. It means it's the attitude of the airplane. In this particular case, this is fixed. This airplane thing is fixed, although you can move it up and down. And then what's gyroscopically driven is the background. In this particular case, the airplane is in a right turn, isn't it? And the nose is about at 1 degree above the horizon? Or is that 10 degrees? It could be 10 degrees. I don't remember for sure. But the gyroscope, no matter which way the airplane rolls like this, the gyroscope, it resists being turned along with the airplane. By resisting, I mean it doesn't always work, because if you're doing a lot of maneuvers, that it's going to affect that gyroscope, and chances are it's going to be a little cocky for a while, a little off, cocked to the left or right side, and then you have to wait for a while until the gyroscope spins up again and it settles down. It doesn't happen as often with the attitude indicator as it does with the heading indicator. Okay, it's stable in smooth flight. Rarely did I see, or have I seen, the attitude indicator change in flight unless it wasn't getting enough vacuum, unless the vacuum filter was clogged, or unless the instrument itself was just starting to go bad. And unfortunately, that has happened to me a lot during the years of my aviation career. Maneuvers will create errors in the instruments, so they're not bulletproof. Okay, now we go to the heading indicator. Remember we talked about 360 degrees on the compass and the fact that you drop off the last 0. So this whole face here is driven by the gyro. This says push the cage, which means that if you don't want it tumbling while you're doing maneuvers, you push that little thing and it freezes the gyroscope in the position with the airplane. So no matter what you do up in the air, no matter what kind of maneuver you're doing, stalls or steep turns or whatever, that gyroscope is not allowed to move. And that's good because you can damage, a lot of heavy aerobatics, you can damage an attitude indicator. I mean, a heading indicator, and also an attitude indicator. So on aerobatic airplanes, they have to be very, very careful about the kind of stresses they put on these gyroscopes that are inside the instruments. So we're talking about 360 degrees in a circle, and we drop off to 0. If the controller says, and generally most controllers actually add zeros. They'll say, turn left heading 350 degrees, or turn left 060. If he's giving you commands and it's down at the point where it's 60 degrees, let's say, instead of 120 degrees, he's going to add a leading zero. So he's going to say, if he wants you to turn to 90 degrees, which is east, he'll say turn right heading 090. Right. So he adds the zero in the front and he puts the zero in the back, even though your heading indicator says that it lopped off all of the zeros. So just remember, though, those are very clear instructions that you're going to get. If he says 060, you turn to what says on that heading indicator. It says just 6, in fact, right? But you got to remember that 060 is that heading right there. Not a big deal when you've got triple numbers like 300. The heading right now is 300. He may say turn left heading 270. So where would you turn to on that indicator? Turn left to 270. Where would it be? West, right? West? Yeah, west. Yeah. Okay. You must leave off the last zero. We just talked about that. And then if there's one digit, then they add a leading zero. This is another one of those situations where in instrument conditions you are required by the Federal Aviation Regulations to reset your heading indicator every 15 minutes. And I'm not sure why the gyro in the heading indicator needs to be reset so often when the gyro in the attitude indicator doesn't have to be reset. In fact, there's no way to reset the heading indicator, but there is a way to reset the attitude and the heading indicator, even though there's no way to reset the attitude indicator. And I don't know the answer to that. I have no idea. I've never researched that difference. When you take off, it takes at least, for most aircraft, at least 20 minutes before the gyro gets up to its designed speed. And I've heard numbers ranging anywhere from 15,000 revolutions per minute up to 27,000 revolutions per minute. You don't have to worry about that, but in either case, just keep in mind that those gyroscopes spin at a huge rate of speed. I mean, 27,000 revolutions every minute is a huge number. And as I said, it has to be reset every 15 minutes. And IMC, sometimes pilots confuse the letters IFR from IMC. If it's IFR, it means you are behaving according to the instrument flight rules. And most people will say, I'm in IFR conditions. Well, that's not really true. If you hear some pilot say, look, I can't, the tower controller says, you have an aircraft off your right wing 4 miles. The pilot will come back and say, I'm in IFR, I can't see that airplane. He's not correct. He's not in IFR, he's in IMC. He is under IFR rules, instrument flying rules. But he's in IMC, instrument meteorological conditions. But I have to tell you, I've heard very, very few pilots ever use the phrase IMC. Once in a while you'll get a guy who really wants to be exactly accurate, and he'll respond to the tower by saying, I can't see that aircraft because I'm an IMC. He's right. He's absolutely right. Hey. The turn and bank. It's kind of a neat instrument, especially for learning how to be a good pilot with your rudder pedals. If you are a glider pilot, your stick and rudder coordination is probably going to be fantastic. If you are a power pilot, after you get your license, you are likely to forget all about the rudder pedals, except when you're on the ground, you're trying You're trying to steer the airplane on the ground. Then you use the rudder pedals. But in flight, sad to say, power pilots don't have an appreciation for rudder pedals. And they probably shouldn't have to have a big appreciation, because turning an aircraft with power is a lot easier, and it doesn't induce what we call adverse yaw. Adverse yaw is a word that says that, and it has to do with creating drag. It has to do with the fact that when you lower or raise the aileron to make a turn, right? So let's say you want to make a turn to the left. The right aileron goes down, the left aileron goes up. So the airflow pushes one way, pushes up, and this pushes it down, right? In doing that, by lowering the aileron, it's like a little flap, isn't it? Because if you lower the aileron below the wing surface, now it becomes kind of like a flap. And when it does, it starts generating more lift along that flap surface. What else comes along with lift? Drag. And in a glider, it is so obvious, because if I tell the student, put your feet on the floor and try to turn left, if he takes the stick and moves it to the left like he should, the nose will start swinging to the right. Because there's so much drag induced by that aileron going down that it's called adverse yaw, which means it's yawing in the wrong direction. And it's yawing that way because of the lift produced by the aileron and the drag produced by the lift. So it's really important to learn how to use your rudder pedals properly in glider flying, not so much in power flying. So keep in mind that adverse yaw is a very, very important factor in gliders, not so much in power planes. In fact, I have a hard time demonstrating adverse yaw to my power students, because the airplane just won't respond. When I tell you, all right, take your feet off the floor, make a left turn, they make a left turn, and almost nothing happens. You'd have to kind of look at it really closely, even to see the nose begin to turn to the right and then roll into a left turn. It almost doesn't happen. It's so close. But I can tell you, in gliders, it's phenomenal. That airplane just starts swinging to the right, and then it comes around and goes left. But the immediate reaction is when you take the stick and move it to the left to make a left turn, the nose will start swinging to the right, and it comes up and over. Okay, the turn and bank has a couple of interesting things about it. One is it defines, these little marks here define what we call a standard rate turn. And the important thing about a standard rate turn is if you keep those wings pointed at those little blocks, you will turn 360 degrees in exactly 2 minutes. And it doesn't make any difference, by the way, what speed you're flying at, right? Because if you're flying at a real fast speed, won't your circle be much greater? And if you're flying at a slow speed, your circle will be much tighter. That instrument doesn't care. It doesn't care what speed you're flying at. It will always point to, if you want to turn for 2 minutes, you always will bank the aircraft so that either one of these wingtips is on that bar. That's great for instrument flying. It doesn't necessarily mean something if you're just not having a good time and flying under visual flight conditions, but it does work extremely well in instrument flying. Okay, so this ball represents coordination between the stick and the rudder. If you are going to make a turn and you want to do the turn properly, you're going to need to use at least a little bit of rudder in order to keep the ball in the center during the turn. If the ball, a left turn, let's assume we're turning left, huh? If the ball comes out here, you're skidding through the turn. You would skid in a car. If the ball goes here on a left turn, it means you're slipping. You're slipping into that turn. If it's in the center, it means you're perfectly coordinated all the way around the curve. You're neither skidding nor slipping. And that's why that particular instrument is important, especially important for glider flying, but also equally important for instrument flying, because you rely on that to be able to do the procedures you'll be reading an instrument chart, and it'll say, make a 2-minute time turn. So when you go over an electronic signal over the airport, you'll make what is called a procedure turn. You come back in, and sending down to the airport in a cloud. You have to be able to make 2-minute time turns. You have to make standard rate turns. And if you don't have that, it's pretty difficult to make a good 2-minute time turn, a standard rate turn, without that instrument. Turn and bank measures the quality of the turn. That means you're neither skidding nor slipping. But when you become pilots, you're going to want to do both of those. You're going to want to do slipping more than skidding. I don't know how many conditions under which you would want to skid. Skid's pretty dangerous, especially when you're low to the ground. If you're making a left turn going into an airport, one of the problems for people spinning and going into the ground is that they were skidding on the turn from base to final. And that we just covered, 360 degrees in 2 minutes. Okay, the last instrument is the magnetic compass. Not a lot to talk about here, but there's what it looks like. It's kind of odd because a lot of pilots set their heading indicator the wrong way. It's because north, the heading indicator, if you're flying this, the heading indicator north is to the left of the lubber line. It's called a lubber line, right? L-U-B-B-E-R. So this is up. So they'll look at that and they'll set their head indicator exactly the opposite of the way they should be setting it. You've got to be really careful about that. But again, this is one of the, remember we showed the cockpits of the 747s? So almost every aircraft flying in the world today, even the Concorde, had a compass in it. Okay, the compass itself, that little ring, is floating in kerosene. So no matter what happens to the airplane, that little ring always points north, to the north magnetic pole. And apparently the reason they use kerosene is because it's inexpensive. It doesn't rust anything like water would. It's enough so that you can float something in it like this particular little compass ring. So you will see, sometimes you get in an airplane and you'll see, look at the compass and you'll see maybe the kerosene is halfway. Well, that should be filled up. I mean, it should be, having kerosene only halfway is going to have some effect on the compass. And again, it's one of those things where with GPS, all bets are off, right? So it's got turning and acceleration errors, and that's one of the reasons why it's very, very difficult to use it in flying. Because whether you're turning left or right, or whether you're accelerating or decelerating, the compass does funny things. And I'm not going to get into it because it's too much for you to try to remember, because even I can't remember. And then we talked about variation, where the compass is always pointing to the magnetic pole, but the farther you get on the east and west coasts of the United States, the variation between true north, the maps, and magnetic north, the information on the aeronautical chart, you'll see that later because I'm going to be passing out aeronautical charts for everybody to look at when we get into that. Anyway, that concludes this session. What I want you to do now is you have your essays to send those forward. Pardon? You should have all had them all on here. Pardon? We don't turn them into you. All the references? What do you mean? You said we had to give them to you, remember? Yeah. I want, no, not the references. The references should have been on here. Right? Yeah. So what are you saying? Tell me what you're saying. This is what you wanted to turn in. You mean, The paper itself?
Yeah.
You email it to me, you mean?
No, like to give it to you. You want it?
I want you to give this to me,
Yeah.
right? I don't get what you're saying. Tell me what you're saying. Are you, yeah, I want you to pass this in. Right. Pardon? Oh, okay. There you go, Andrew. Okay, so pass all your essays forward. Your essay draft paper. Okay. Essay. Zachary, essay. Essay draft. Thank you, Catherine.
I mixed it.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I mixed it. I got it so mixed it.
Oh, okay. What is it?
Let's staple this together so there's two pages.
Is this your draft, or you? So you don't have the form, right? Yeah, I'll take both. Okay. I would have appreciated you guys using the form that I gave you. I mean, it's okay. I'll do my best to try to dig through here and find out the answers to all five and the references, right? You turned in here? Oh, okay. Well, thank you. Any questions? I'm sorry, what? Well, if you do, there's going to be a penalty for it, sure. As anything else, if you're not on time, you have to pay the price. Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you.